Okay, welcome. Paul Deemer is here to talk about what is project finance and why is it important. Paul's a retired partner, as it says up on the screen, in residence at Vincent & Elkins, where he spent his legal career. During that time, he's focused on international mergers and acquisitions and on the development and financing of international energy projects. Over the course of his career, he opened his firm's offices in Moscow and Beijing and was based in London prior to retiring from the partnership. Paul currently works of counsel with Vincent Elkins on energy transactions and projects, assisting companies headquartered in one country in the acquisition of energy companies and assets in other nations. Paul's qualified to practice in Texas as well as here. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt University, where he's an adjunct professor and regularly teaches a short course on project finance. He also is a visiting professor at Queen Mary in London and CUHK in Hong Kong, where the latter he focuses more on energy law. I initially met Paul a couple of years ago at Vanderbilt. It's a pleasure to meet up with him again, and we're delighted he's come here to provide what will no doubt be an intriguing introduction to project finance. Hand it over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm delighted to be here today at the Center for Corporate and Commercial Law. I haven't been to Cambridge in a while and forgotten how beautiful the city is, even in the rain. So it's good to be back. Today, we have a little bit of a tough job today to try to cover, at least from a high level, what is project finance and why is it important. And I'm currently teaching a course on project development and finance in Hong Kong over 13 weeks. So somehow we're going to have to condense a little bit of that into about a half an hour. And then we'll have questions after that, if you have any questions, which I hope you will. And if you have any as we go along, please don't hesitate to jump in. Let me start with an example of why is project finance important. Some years ago, two clients walked into my office in London, and they said, "We have a new project we'd like for you to work on with us. It's a private power plant. It's going to be privately owned. It will generate electric power into the national grid. It's going to be built in Teesside, England. It's going to be 1,800 megawatts, which is a pretty big plant. At the time, it was the biggest private power project in England. And but we don't have any fuel for this plant, so we're going to arrange for the development of two new natural gas fields in the North Sea and a new pipeline to pump the natural gas into Teesside. And we're going to sell the electricity to regional power companies, and we're going to get a contractor to build it, and we're going to project finance it." And at the time, I had a general idea of what project finance was about, but I'd never really worked on a big one like that. So anyway, they ended, as they left our building, they said, "You know, if this project goes forward, this will change your life." And I thought, you know, this is all hyperbole. This is not right. But as a matter of fact, it did go forward, and it did change my life, because after that, it led to more projects in Indonesia, and India, and China, and Vietnam. And so it was actually responsible for me moving to China. So anyway, just to give you a quick summary of what happened on that project, we negotiated to buy natural gas, we negotiated a construction contract, we negotiated the sale of electricity to regional power companies, and we got into the project financing, negotiating with a group of banks. The banks reviewed all of our documentation during what they call the due diligence process. And during that process, they discovered what they thought was a problem with the fuel supply. They thought the fuel supply contracts were not sufficiently strong. So we argued about that for quite a while, and then eventually we had to take the fuel supply contract to a senior QC in London to see if the QC agreed that there was a problem or not a problem. And happily, the QC confirmed that the contracts were perfectly fine. The contracts were signed, the financing closed, and ultimately the project was built and started operating. And this was a process that went on over 5 years until the commercial operation date when the plant actually started generating electricity. So that just gives you, and the project operated successfully for 20 years. So it gives you a quick view of the type of project that gets project financed. But that still doesn't answer the question, what is project finance and what isn't it? Why is it used? And what are the documents and the people involved? And what is the role of a lawyer? So we'll talk about those. So what is project finance? It's a method of project funding using project cash flow from the project itself to pay back the debt. So if you think of my two clients who walked into the office, they made a joint venture with a chemical company and they formed a project company which actually built the power plant. So the project company sold its electricity to power, electric distribution companies. And that cash flow from the sale of electricity was used to pay for the project, to pay for financing, for principal and interest on the loan, to pay for the cost of operating the project, to pay for the construction contractor. So anyway, I think the point here is a method of debt financing for a major project. It's not the same as financing projects. So for example, if you were General Motors and you wanted to add a new line to your product line in Detroit, you might go to your banks and borrow money as General Motors. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about a special purpose subsidiary that's building a single project. So what types of projects are we talking about? Typically, large capital-intensive projects with revenue-generating assets. So in the case of my clients, the revenue came from electricity sales. You might have a client building, let's say, a widget factory, selling widgets to purchasers. In that case, the revenue flow would be coming from the widget sales. Typically, project financings are used for energy, infrastructure, transportation projects. So if you're building a toll road, you might use a project finance. If you're building a chemical factory, chemical plant, or an LNG facility, or an electric power plant. The lenders in the financing agree to look principally to project cash flows for loan repayment. And what I mean is we're talking about limited recourse or non-recourse financing. Now, what do we mean by limited recourse or non-recourse financing? We'll talk about that in just a second. But basically it means that the ultimate shareholders, the sponsors of the project, the two clients who walked into my office, their potential loss is limited to their ownership of the project company. So if the project company goes bust, the project doesn't go forward, the sponsors have not guaranteed the project to the banks. The sponsors can walk away, dust themselves off, and try to put together a new project. That's what we would call non-recourse finance. The banks have agreed to look solely to the project itself and the project company to obtain repayment. Collateral is generally the project assets. In our case, it would be a piece of land, an electric power plant, maybe some pipelines, a lot of equipment, machinery, contracts. Now, why do people want to use project finance? Let me say, you could put first on the list that the sponsors are looking for limited recourse or non-recourse financing. If they get a non-recourse loan from the banks, it means that they do not have to, may not have to view that as part of they may not have to make a commitment from their company to pay back the loan, which would be reflected on their balance sheets, which would be reflected in their financial statements. And so the sponsors would be able to make a number of different project investments with the same amount of money. And I think that's reflected by this chart, which not only shows that point, but also the point of how high leverage affects the return from the project. So on the right-hand side, you'll see if the project cost is £1,000, let's say, and the sponsors are able to borrow £800 from the banks, and £200 they put into their own equity capital. Assuming a 7% interest rate, the interest payable is £56. Revenue is 100, so out of the £100 of revenue, the profit is 44 pounds. The return on equity, assuming 200 pounds of equity and 44 pounds of profit, is 22%. Now, on the other hand, if the sponsors have taken 1,000 pounds of their own money and used that to pay the project costs, they would not be borrowing any money at all. They have 100 pounds of revenue, their profit is 100 pounds, and their return on equity is only 10%. So by bringing in lenders with a highly leveraged loan, that is, for example, 80% of the total cost of the project, the sponsors are able to increase their return on equity from 10% to 22%. And what it means is they're only having to commit 200 pounds of their equity to this particular project, as opposed to this alternative where they're committing 1,000 pounds. So it means they can, instead of building one project, they can build 5 and end up with profits of 220 pounds a year. So not only does it preserve their equity for other projects, but it increases their return on equity. Does that make sense? And that's what we mean when we refer to the benefits of high leverage. Now, on a typical project financing, the sponsor's goal is to try to have as much leverage as possible. Here we have 80%, 20%, which is sort of the ideal. If the project is very risky or involves particular problems or an unstable legal system in the country where the project is being built, then the lenders might not agree to lend 80% of the project costs. They might want to lend 70 or 60%, which would reduce the financial benefit, the leverage of the project. So again, the goal is would be an 80-20 percent split between debt and equity on the project. Now, just to touch again the issue of recourse versus non-recourse, keeping in mind that we have a project company that's owned by our sponsors, the two people who walked into my office, and a non-recourse financing. The lenders loan the 80% of the cost of the project, and they agree that they will look only to the revenue generated by the project company. They have no recourse to the sponsor other than the sponsor's equity that it puts into the project. Now, what do we mean by limited recourse? Let's say that the banks are not entirely happy with a non-recourse loan. They say the project is a little too risky. We need some help on this. For example, we're not sure the project will actually be built. Your construction contractor is very good, but it's going to take a lot of new technology. We're not sure the project will operate properly. So what we would like is for the sponsors to guarantee the project loan until the project is actually built and operated. And that's called a project completion guarantee. And what it really means is that when the project actually does get built, if the project passes some performance tests so that it operates properly, at that point, the sponsor's guarantee will end, will fall away. Now, another possible limited recourse alternative is contingent equity. The bank's saying to the sponsors, okay, if you have cost overruns in building the plant, then you agree you will put more equity, more of your own funds into the project, just to be sure that the cost overruns will be paid and that the project will be completed on time. Now, there may also be affiliate contracts. So, for example, the sponsors may have affiliated companies that provide services to the project. And in that case, those affiliate contracts could be viewed as a sort of sponsor support. And there may even be a shareholder support agreement where the sponsors agree with the banks that they will continue to be involved in the project and support the project technically and financially. But it's a relatively soft undertaking by the sponsors. So, moving on from that, let me just quickly run through the sort of the advantages and disadvantages of project financing. There are disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is it involves a lot of lawyers. Now, we might consider that to be an advantage, actually, because it means legal fees for lawyers. But from a sponsor standpoint, it is expensive. It involves a lot of lender oversight. The transaction process to negotiate these documents is a longer period, anything from 2 to 5 years. Complex documentation, extensive due diligence. So those are all reasons that some people cite as saying, I don't really want a project financing. What I'll do is I'll just go to the bank and borrow the money and be done with it. It's very quick, it's very easy. But what they'll be missing out on, of course, is the benefits, which are a limited recourse or non-recourse loan, perhaps the ability not to show the project on the balance sheet of the sponsors, project being paid back out of cash flow. There may be tax and customs advantages from from the local government where the project is built. Now, just a quick summary of what does project finance facilitate. It's frequently used to develop or monetize natural resources. In emerging markets, it's often used to build and pay for new infrastructure, for example, electric power plants. We had another project in South Africa, in the Western Cape, involving wind power projects that were developed in part on a project finance basis. And the South African government was using the project financing mechanism as a way of getting the wind power projects built with no government support on the project from a financial standpoint, because they didn't have the money available. Reduction of public sector expenditure and borrowing, access to private sector capital, and efficiency, competition, and innovation. And at the bottom, ability for sponsors to achieve significant returns on equity, going back to the chart I showed you a minute ago. When can you say that a project is really suitable for project finance? Well, I think the lenders who are making the project loan on a non-recourse basis want to be sure that the project ticks a certain number of boxes. They want the sponsors to be experienced with solid credit backing. Does the project make economic sense? If your electric power plant is generating electricity for $10 a kilowatt hour, whereas the market price or the price to the grid is normally $5, then it doesn't make economic sense. Is there a strong economic rationale for the project? Are there robust long-term supply and offtake contracts? In our example, we had very strong natural gas supply, and we had very strong offtake agreements with regional electricity companies. Are the counterparties financially strong and experienced? By counterparties, I mean the purchasers of the product that you're producing, the construction contractor, who we refer to as the EPC contractor, is building the project. Are these strong, experienced companies? Proven technology, or is the project using new technology that has never been tried out before, that's being promoted by a company in China that you really don't know anything about? Equator principles. The Equator principles are a framework adopted by financial institutions to assure or assess the environmental and social, a variety of environmental and social factors with respect to the project. Is the project going to satisfy the requirements of the Equator principles? These are minimum standards that the project would need to satisfy. And is there government support? Does the government, where you're building the project, does it support the project? Is there a clear legal and fiscal regime? Now, who are the participants in the project? Now, I've sort of divided this between project development, meaning the actual putting together and building the project, and the project financing the project, obviously. So let me give you a quick picture of all this, which may help to understand. If you'll recall, we have the sponsors at the top who are putting together the project. they may use holding companies as their ownership vehicle. And they're putting together a project company that actually owns and operates an electric power project. So this is the key company. And it borrows from the lenders under a credit agreement, also called a loan agreement or a facility agreement from the lenders. And there may actually be several facility agreements if it's a large project. So the project company is not only doing the work, but it's also the borrower under the financing. The project company enters into what you could call off-take agreements. In this case, it's an electric power plant, so it's entering into a power purchase agreement with a power purchaser. It's signing a contract with an EPC contractor, which is the construction contractor, which promises to build the plant on time and to specification for an agreed price. There might be a fuel supplier, and that the project company is building a wind power project or a solar power project. There won't be a fuel supplier. There will just be the project company producing the electricity. And then you may have an operations and maintenance contractor or O&M contractor that actually manages the operation and the maintenance of the project. So, going back to our list, we've talked about sponsors, project company, construction contractor, fuel supplier, operator, and advisors, you and me. From a financing standpoint, the project company is the borrower. We have a group of lenders, commercial lenders or banks. We may have export credit agencies involved. These are export credit agencies are set up to promote the sale of exports. For example, in Japan, you would have JBIC or KXM or USXM who would be promoting the sales from Japan or the US or Korea of products produced by local companies. You may have multilateral financial institutions as lenders, for example, EBRD in London, or Asian Development Bank in Manila, or the IFC, part of the World Bank in Washington. You may have bilateral financial institutions such as Korean Development Bank, and again, you have advisors. Now, to sort of wrap up the financing.
Take your time.
Yeah.
With it. So we've got another 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. To quickly run through the loan and security documents that would normally be used on project financing. These documents typically start with a letter of intent, which is a short, non-binding letter from the banks indicating that they're willing to lend to the project or interested in lending to the project. It's not a commitment. And the project company can use that letter of intent to go to other parties involved in the project and convince them that the project actually has substance and is going forward because we've got lenders who are interested. Mandate or commitment letters would be a more formal letter signed between the project company and the banks, which would outline the terms which would be used on the financing, subject to some very big subject to due diligence, subject to approval by the bank's credit committees, subject to no changes in the market. Here again, I think you would view those as non-binding, but they would take the financing terms a step down the road. The next stage of the process would be the negotiation of term sheets with the banks. And the term sheets for project financing can vary from 20 pages to hundreds of pages, depending on how much detail the parties want to go into. But it can go into very great detail, including not only the things you would expect to see, for example, the pricing, the interest rate under the loan, the repayment, prepayment terms, representations and warranties, covenants, indemnities, and any other special terms related to the financing. The term sheets are important because they are used by the bank's lawyers to prepare the loan documents, the credit agreement or loan agreement, and the other loan documents that go with the project loan. They're also important in the due diligence process. The lawyers on both sides use the term sheets as a sort of a roadmap for analyzing the project to be sure that it makes sense and that the project contracts are strong and robust. Ultimately, this leads to a facility or credit or loan agreement between the banks and the project company. And there will be security documentation, for example, mortgages, assignments of security, and other security arrangements. There may be negative pledges under which the borrower, the project company, agrees to restrict its borrowings from other parties. There may be, or its pledges of its assets. There may be accounts agreements. There will be accounts agreements which govern the operation of the project company's bank accounts, so that when money flows into the project, it will be properly used according to the terms of the accounts agreements. The accounts agreements are particularly important because they establish a sort of a priority. So when money flows into the project from the off-taker, the power purchaser in our case, money would flow through the accounts of the project company in accordance with the terms of the accounts agreements with the banks. So, as an example, the first pound that comes into the project company from its customers would be used to pay for operations and maintenance of the project to keep the project going. Any money coming in after that first tranche of funds would be used to pay the bank's principal and interest. Banks would normally be number 2 in the waterfall. And then subsequent amounts would be used for other terms required under the security documents. Now, we've talked about this. What is the role of a lawyer? Well, as I mentioned earlier, one of the really good or really bad things about project financing is that it is legally very intensive. And starting from the very beginning, project structuring, sitting down with the clients and figuring out a legal structure for the project that makes sense. Going through the internal project with your clients, which would be a type of due diligence with your clients only, to try to figure out if there are any particular problems with the project that ought to be identified at an early stage. Risk analysis, trying to analyze where the risks lie in the project. So, for example, if the project is being built in a particularly risky jurisdiction that has a very unpredictable legal system, that has political issues. They may have a change in government coming up. These are all issues that might surface as part of the risk analysis. Tax and regulatory advice are obvious, land acquisition. If there are environmental issues, these may involve not only lawyers, but also environmental consultants. Negotiating the project contracts is where the lawyers really find their very important role in the project, because obviously they would be involved in almost all of the project contracts. Now, it may be necessary to involve local lawyers in the country where the project is being built. You may, if the project is being built in Indonesia, then you may need Indonesian lawyers to help you with land acquisition, with project contracts that are governed by Indonesian law, with regulatory matters in Indonesia. The lawyers also provide advice on financing structure, negotiating the financing and security documents, and any disputes that come up during the entire process. So that gives you sort of a quick rundown on some of the important roles that lawyers may play when they're involved in a project financing. Now, I think that sort of covers what we were going to cover today. I'm sorry, I've run over a little bit.
It was perfect. So thanks a lot, first of all.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.